The lost tape, CIA psychic predicted alien's voice. The voice that shouldn't exist. It starts with a sound no one can quite name, metallic, melodic, almost like speech. The frequency shifts in ways that make human listeners instinctively lean closer. It doesn't match any known language, yet it carries rhythm, intention, almost emotion. Beneath it, a human gasp cuts through the static. Someone murmurs, "Are you hearing this?" Then silence. That 30-second fragment would later make its way across the early web, buried on bulletin boards and mirrored FTP sites under a single label, Project 77 Voice. Its origin? Unknown. Its language? Undeciphered. And yet, decades later, its patterns would appear to match something that by all logic shouldn't exist at all. A line from a classified CIA transcript, written years before the recording ever surfaced. The story of that connection begins with a leak nobody cared about in 1997. A nameless user on a now-defunct UFO forum posted a broken audio link along with coordinates that didn't correspond to any known server. Within hours, people trying to download it reported corrupted files. Some claimed their machines crashed midway through playback. Others insisted they heard different versions of the same tape, slightly altered pitch, new layers each time it was played. Most dismissed it as hoax material, the kind of thing the early internet teemed with. But one researcher archived it on a personal hard drive labeled Anomalous Linguistics 1. For the next 20 years it sat untouched, forgotten, until the file was rediscovered during a digital preservation project for UFO studies. When engineers ran it through modern spectral analysis, something strange appeared, repeating frequency modulations that followed rhythmic intervals eerily similar to human prosody, the natural cadence of spoken language, but with vowel sounds no human throat could reproduce. Linguists described it as structured chaos, too ordered to be random, too alien to be categorized. There were no matching phonemes, no linguistic family ties. The waveform itself carried patterns that looked intentional, as if shaped rather than generated. Yet there was nothing in the chain of custody, no tape reel, no studio log, no metadata, to verify where it came from. It existed only as compressed data without a past. That should have been the end of it. Another unsourced oddity filed under Internet Folklore, until a retired analyst recognized something buried in the signal's coded naming structure. P77. Those initials resembled an internal shorthand used in declassified CIA indexes for a very different domain, psychic intelligence experiments once grouped under Project Stargate. When the analyst compared the recovered audio frequencies to notes from an old remote viewing transcript, the alignment was uncanny. The transcript, dated 1984, described a tonal interference perceived by a psychic while targeting what they called a non-terrestrial source. In the margin beside those words, a cryptic notation appeared. Sequence resembles minor key vocalization, low-high-low, record if perceived. That's what unsettled the researchers the most. A remote viewing session, conducted 13 years before the tape appeared, already describing a pattern identical to the alien language recording. No one can prove the connection, but the coincidence is hard to ignore. If the psychic truly heard those sounds years before the alleged recording existed, then either both drew from the same imaginative well, or something deeper links them. That's where this story turns from speculation to investigation. Because buried beneath every conspiracy theory and every rumor about CIA secrets lies one verifiable truth. Project Stargate was real. Funded for nearly 2 decades by U.S. intelligence, it employed soldiers and civilians to test whether the human mind could perceive distant events. Before we can grasp how anyone could hear something no one else had, we need to rewind, back to the height of the Cold War, when the U.S. government began wondering if perception itself could become an instrument. To Fort Meade, Maryland, where secret rooms hummed with quiet ambition. To the moment intelligence agencies decided that the human mind, not the microphone, might be the ultimate sensor of the unknown. The mind as a sensor. At the height of the Cold War, the most secret rooms in American intelligence didn't buzz with machines. They hummed with silence. Inside Fort Meade, Maryland, a handful of analysts sat in windowless offices staring at blank walls, eyes closed, searching for coordinates written on slips of paper. They weren't deciphering spy codes. They were looking, without moving, for submarines, weapons tests, even people. Their eyes stayed shut, but they swore they could see. This was Project Stargate, the government's attempt to turn the human mind into a sensor. Officially, it started in 1978, though earlier research under names like Grill Flame and Center Lane had been quietly running for years. The idea was simple but staggering, that trained psychics might describe far-off places or hidden objects through a discipline called remote viewing. The Soviets were rumored to be experimenting with similar techniques, and American intelligence couldn't risk being left behind. The program's founders believed perception might extend beyond the body. To test that, technicians placed subjects, often soldiers or civilians with claimed extrasensory skills, inside isolated rooms. A random number generated coordinates for a secret target known only to the controllers. The viewer would sketch impressions, shapes, colors, textures. Sometimes they'd write single words that emerged unbidden. Later, analysts would compare those notes to real photographs from reconnaissance flights or satellite imagery. When matches lined up even partially, enthusiasm grew. Small coincidences became evidence. Some sessions seemed to produce uncanny results. Details of terrain or buildings that matched future satellite shots released later. But accuracy was erratic. Most sessions were vague at best. Still, the deeper mystery wasn't whether these people could predict troop movements. It was what their minds were touching. Researchers like Ingo Swann, a painter-turned-psychic consultant, argued that remote viewing tapped into fields of consciousness bigger than brain or geography. His drawings of planetary features, rings around Jupiter, structures on the moon, blurred the boundary between intelligence work and metaphysical exploration. Where others saw espionage, he saw exploration of reality itself. The Army's Skip Atwater, who managed the sessions at Fort Meade, described the training in almost scientific language. He spoke of calibration, signal detection, noise filtering. The human psyche became a radar array, scanning not through frequency but through intention. If distance didn't matter, he reasoned, maybe neither did time. That idea, non-local perception, became the philosophical backbone of Stargate. The viewers weren't merely describing hidden bunkers, they were trespassing into moments. Some experiments targeted events days ahead, others decades past. The results were unpredictable, and yet when overlay charts appeared surprisingly accurate, internal memos multiplied. The CIA wanted duplication, measurement, control. How do you quantify mind? The core problem was always validation. When sessions hit, they seemed unearthly. When they missed, critics dismissed them as fantasy. But what kept the funding alive wasn't proof, it was possibility. If there was even a 1% chance that consciousness could pierce barriers, ignoring it might mean ceding an unimaginable advantage to the enemy. Each remote viewer brought a different flavor to the experiment. Pat Price, a former police officer, claimed he could float through secure installations as if the walls were transparent. His sketches of exotic machinery at foreign bases were taken seriously enough that agencies quietly checked satellite archives for corroboration. They rarely found any. Yet the drawings kept coming, annotated with mechanical labels no one taught him. Swann's sessions grew stranger. Asked once to view a set of lunar coordinates, he described crystalline towers and faint geometric hums, echoes of energy. Listeners noted the language he used: resonance, tone, vibration. The reports called it metaphorical, but Swann insisted it was literal, that the moon wasn't silent. By the early 198s, the language of the lab began borrowing from both physics and mysticism. Analysts talked about frequencies of consciousness as if thought were electromagnetic. Every target produced a unique mental timbre, a soundless note perceived only in awareness. Some viewers said the impressions arrived as tones rather than images, a sustained hum they later translated into drawings. It was here, among those experiments, that the seeds of a later mystery were planted. Within the vaults of Stargate, a few transcripts diverged from the usual military targets. They mentioned glimpses of non-human intelligences, architectural shapes too vast for Earth, and communications that seemed musical rather than linguistic. The official line was to archive them without comment. Privately, some staff wondered whether the viewers were tuning into psychological archetypes or something else. The scientists running oversight panels grew uneasy. The CIA wanted measurable intelligence, not cosmic riddles. Yet the more they tried to steer the sessions toward practical outcomes, the more the content slipped toward the fantastic. Patterns, lights, impossible structures, and often sound. "It's not visual this time," one viewer said during a monitored session. "It's like a tone coming through the dark." That phrase circulated quietly through the unit, tone through the dark. To outsiders it meant nothing. To those sitting in the dim, soundproof rooms, it represented frontier contact, the threshold between imagination and detection. If the mind could pick up a tone that sensors couldn't, what did that imply? As experiments multiplied, skeptics within the Defense Intelligence Agency began pushing for empirical scrutiny. They conducted blind tests, randomized targets paired with unknowing analysts. Statistical results hovered barely above chance. Critics declared the anomaly closed. But away from official reports, the participants still traded anecdotes of astonishing hits, descriptions that later proved uncannily close to reality. For them, probability charts couldn't erase what they had felt. By 1985, Stargate had evolved into a hybrid world where science met spirituality, bureaucracy balanced on wonder. Funding reports justified the work as counterintelligence research, yet the conversations drifting through the halls sounded philosophical. What if thought itself was a universal medium, a carrier wave? That question haunted Atwater. He began speaking of consciousness as hardware, something that could resonate, receive, even transmit. If human minds could tune into distant space or time, perhaps they could intercept messages never meant for ears. During one internal briefing, he remarked, "We might hear them before we see them." Most present considered it poetic. One stenographer wrote it down word for word. Years later, when fragments of a mysterious audio file surfaced online, the so-called alien voice, researchers would rediscover that note in the archives and wonder if Atwater's remark was more than metaphor. But for the people inside Fort Meade, it was just another day of exploration behind classification codes. By the program's final decade, skepticism grew louder. A 1995 review by the American Institutes for Research concluded that remote viewing had produced no actionable intelligence. Funding ceased, personnel dispersed, and the rooms at Fort Meade went silent. The official story ended there. Yet in that hush lay hundreds of pages of transcripts describing sensations no radar ever captured. Those documents, half forgotten, half myth, would later collide with something that seemed to echo from outside history. A voice recorded years after the program died, but repeating the tone one psychic once described as "not from here." Before we reach that connection, we need to step into the next phase of Stargate, when curiosity turned into obsession, and the sessions entered forbidden territory. The Forbidden Sessions. By the mid-198s, the walls of Fort Meade had absorbed more secrets than any archive could hold. Most remote viewing experiments followed routine: geographic targets, military installations, mundane coordinates. But a few sessions broke pattern. They took aim at locations no map contained. The technicians called them unstructured targets. The viewers called them something else entirely: frontiers. Ingo Swan's notes from these sessions read less like intelligence briefs and more like witness testimonies from another world. In one, he described approaching the moon and sensing man-made activity there, structures glinting beneath the dust, towers of translucent stone rising from shadowed craters. He wrote of geometric pulses echoing through the regolith, sound without air. To analysts accustomed to troop counts and weapon inventories, it sounded like poetry. Yet Swan insisted he wasn't imagining, he was perceiving. Pat Price, once a police detective, claimed an even stranger sight. Tasked with viewing a sealed coordinate, he reported descending into what looked like an underground facility where individuals, not all human, cooperated on mechanical projects. His sketches showed humanoid figures operating spherical devices and elongated tunnels lit by blue light. Internal memos summarized the event blandly. Subject produced imaginative but coherent narrative. Privately, colleagues wondered why his fantasy described machines resembling classified prototypes known only to defense labs. Coincidence? Leakage from his subconscious awareness of earthly designs? Or a genuine intercept from somewhere else? Such sessions unsettled supervisors. The project was meant for intelligence gathering, not cosmic anthropology. Yet curiosity crept in. A small subset of experiments quietly shifted focus from Cold War espionage to cosmic reconnaissance. Skip Atwater later admitted that some participants requested targets off-planet purely out of fascination. Officially, those logs were excluded from reports. Unofficially, copies circulated among the unit under coded labels: Horizon, Mars, Echo. The Mars sessions became legends. In one declassified transcript dating to 1984, a viewer was instructed to observe a planetary location designated by numbers. No planet was named. Minutes into the session, the viewer spoke of an ancient place, pyramid shapes, beings tall, thin, dying. Analysts noted the vivid architectural detail and emotional tone: grief, abandonment, silence. When, later questioned, the viewer claimed they had contacted a species awaiting resurrection through others' help. The phrasing, others' help, appeared again in marginalia from separate sessions months later, suggesting a shared internal mythology spreading among the group. Scientifically, the data meant little. Emotionally, it changed everything. For some, remote viewing no longer mapped spaces, it mapped possibility. If consciousness could reach other planets, maybe minds weren't bound by biology at all. That realization blurred the boundary between research and revelation. Outside critics grew suspicious that Stargate had veered spiritual. Funding memos emphasized practical goals, but inside Fort Meade, the language of the lab turned mystical. Terms like frequency alignment and vibrational intelligence entered reports. Operators began logging auditory phenomena, tones, chords, rhythmic pulses, occurring spontaneously during sessions. One participant described hearing a modulation, like voices just beyond recognition. At first, these remarks were filed as sensory artifacts, the brain's way of filling blanks. Yet one analyst annotated a report with 3 stark words: possible communication attempt. That inference opened a door no policymaker wanted open. If voices were involved, whose were they? The line between remote viewing and mediumship had always been thin. Now it vanished completely. Internal correspondence warned staff to avoid interpretative contamination. But containment was impossible. Viewers began privately comparing experiences, finding shared motifs: light from the west, rhythmic hums, pulsing intervals measured in 3s. Atwater tried to maintain discipline. He reminded teams that the mission was intelligence validation, not cosmic dialogue. Still, he quietly recorded the anomalies. Years later, he'd say those were the sessions he remembered most, because they carried a sense of being observed in return. In a 1985 spiral notebook later declassified, an entry marked Session 77 stands out. The viewer described an encounter not with imagery but with pure sound, a layered resonance, darker than music, moving like speech. Analysts highlighted an unusual phrase: interference frequency not of Earth. That notation would become infamous decades later when internet researchers matched it to the mysterious 1997 audio leak. But in its own time, it barely registered, filed beside doodled waveforms and the comment probable metaphor. The danger wasn't the data, it was belief. Once viewers started interpreting sensory impressions as messages, objectivity dissolved. Rumors spread through the unit that some had contacted intelligences. Supervisors met behind closed doors, debating whether psychic feedback loops might be creating shared hallucinations. One psychologist proposed mass suggestion. Another argued for electromagnetic entrainment, radio waves affecting neural rhythms. No one had evidence, yet the reports persisted, tones, words half heard in the static of consciousness. By 1986, an internal directive limited future targets to verifiable earthly sites. It came too late. The fascination had taken root. Off-record sessions continued between friends after hours, often at home. Participants swapped cassette copies of their spoken impressions, experimenting with playback speeds, claiming to detect harmonics invisible to recording meters. Most sounded like faint hums. A few contained structures eerily similar to vowel formants, utterances without meaning, but patterned enough to suggest intention. To shield the program from ridicule, officials scrubbed references to non-human entities from summaries sent to higher command. Those lines were redacted, replaced with phrases like symbolic imagery or psychological overlay. Entire folders vanished into sealed archives. When declassification finally began in the 199s, much of that content remained missing, classified indefinitely under categories unrelated to psychic research, possibly to distance the agency from any mention of extraterrestrial themes. Within the surviving material, one consistent thread remains: a recurring idea that communication could come through vibration rather than vision. The viewer's notes use words like choral pattern, singing sequence, and cyclic modulation. They seem to believe the universe hummed with intelligible structure, and that tuning consciousness correctly could translate it into sound. To a physicist, that was nonsense. To them, it was discovery. Those experiments became lore, the forbidden sessions. They represented both the height of ambition and the edge of credibility. For every analyst who called them delusional, another whispered that maybe, against all logic, they'd brushed something real. When Project Stargate finally wound down, most of these sessions were buried under layers of classification, too strange even for a program already cloaked in secrecy. But their echoes lingered, in archived tapes, in memory. And eventually, it seems, in one low-fidelity recording that would surface long after the project's death. Whether coincidence or connection, that recording mirrored a detail first written inside Session 77, the interference frequency not of Earth. The phrase was poetic, meaningless, or prophetic, depending on who you ask. Yet it's the hinge of our mystery, the point where speculation meets artifact. Because when that alien voice leaked in 1997, it carried the same rhythm, the same impossible cadence. And nestled deep in the acoustic pattern, analysts would later find intervals matching Swann's own sketch of lunar resonance. Inside Fort Meade, those visions had once been dismissed as imagination. Decades later, the world heard them play back as sound. That realization pushes us forward, into the next chapter, where a lost transcript, long ignored, foreshadows the very voice that would ignite an entire generation of believers and skeptics alike. The prediction lost in the archive. By the time Project Stargate was nearing its end, the novelty had faded. Funding shrank, skepticism rose, and transcripts piled up faster than anyone could read them. Among those papers sat a thin folder that would later feed decades of speculation, Session 77. It was dated mid-1985 and marked with an offhand notation, interference frequency not of Earth. At the time, it meant almost nothing. Now it feels like the first whisper of a prophecy. The session logs open like any other. Coordinate tasking, standard environment, monitored conditions. But halfway through, the viewers stopped describing visuals altogether. Their voice changed tone, unsure, as if translating sensations that didn't belong to vision or touch at all. It's like a sound, the transcript reads. Low to high, cycling modulation, almost speech but not language. Observers in the control room exchanged looks. The viewer wasn't wearing headphones. There was nothing to hear. When the monitor asked for clarification, the response was fragmentary. Layered resonance, moving across, not through, origin unknown. Technicians assumed metaphor. In remote viewing, people use sensory crosstalk all the time, describing colors as temperatures, textures as tastes. But one analyst, curious, scribbled an extra line in the margin, record if perceived. The audio recorder ran quietly beside the session, capturing only the human participant's voice, not whatever they claimed to hear. Later, engineers tested the tape and noted a barely audible undertone, too faint for interpretation. It was written off as background hum. That might have been the end of it if the language of the session hadn't been so distinct. Interference frequency not of Earth stood out among pages of military jargon. To archivists processing the files for declassification in the 199s, it looked like poetic license. They left it untouched. Only after the 1997 leak of Project 77 voice would researchers return to that phrase and shiver at the coincidence. Inside the original Stargate reports, internal correspondence reveals that several analysts debated whether psychic descriptions could ever translate into measurable data. One memo dismisses the 77 session outright. Subject's symbolic interpretation exceeded parameters. Another employee wasn't so quick to file it away. Under the subject line acoustic correlation hypothesis, they proposed running spectral comparisons between recorded environmental noise during sessions and standard electromagnetic interference patterns. The request went nowhere. The program was weeks from shutdown. Skip Atwater, reflecting years later, told a journalist he'd once overheard a participant describe hearing something structured while targeting a distant non-terrestrial coordinate. "We might hear them before we see them," he'd said offhandedly at the time, half joke, half intuition. That stray remark would eventually migrate into online compilations of psychic predictions, an accidental prophecy attached to his name. When historians revisited the archives in the early 200s, they found fragments supporting that story. A briefing note dated August 1986 mentions an analyst requesting additional study of sonic analog data. The line ends with a redacted phrase, 3 black bars masking what might have been a location or project code. Beside it, a pencil annotation simply reads, "See Session 77. The implication was subtle, but impossible to ignore. Somebody inside the intelligence chain had linked a psychic's talk of alien resonance with something tangible enough to reference in another report. Whatever that was, it didn't survive declassification. Reconstruction of the archival trail paints a picture of bureaucratic caution layered over curiosity. Audio reels were labeled, boxed, and later digitalized without much metadata. When independent researchers began sorting the collection, many tapes were silent or erased. Yet one mislabeled DAT fragment contained 3 seconds of indistinct modulation buried under room noise. The waveform analysis showed harmonics roughly matching portions of the so-called alien voice file posted online a decade later. Statistically meaningless, except for timing. How could 2 unrelated recordings, separated by more than 12 years, share that same frequency ladder? Technically, they couldn't without coincidence or manipulation. Conspiracists chose the latter, arguing that the 1997 leak was built from leaked Stargate materials. Skeptics countered that both signals resembled common interference created by consumer audio decks. Still, no one has ever found a precise match to identify what kind of deck or environment produced it. Among former Stargate staff, responses splintered. Some laughed at the idea that psychic vision could predict an internet rumor. Others noted that the phrase interference frequency not of Earth wasn't prophetic until public curiosity gave it meaning. One retired linguist who helped analyze early transcripts offered a subtler explanation. Viewers often used borrowed technical language for feelings, he said. When they said frequency, they meant mood. When they said not of Earth, they meant not ordinary. In that reading, the line was personal, not extraterrestrial, a human attempt to name unfamiliar sensation. Yet fascination with the coincidence only deepened once the digital forensics crowd got involved. Around 2001, an archivist running harmonic overlays between historical Stargate audio and the 1997 leak produced a composite revealing rhythmic similarities. The same low-high-low trill, repeating at intervals near human speech cadence but lacking consonant formants. Linguists called it pareidolia in sound, the ear's version of seeing faces in clouds. But believers pointed out another detail. The psychic in Session 77 claimed the tone felt like communication attempting alignment. Whether accidental or profound, that idea aligned perfectly with what modern listeners described, a voice trying and failing to articulate across boundaries. Documentation gaps make verification impossible. Key tape logs from Fort Meade remain missing, possibly destroyed after the 1995 termination. What survives are scant PDF transcriptions where coffee stains blur data fields, where signatures vanish under black ink. Between those fragments, researchers traced disappearance patterns, the same months that certain experimental units were quietly reabsorbed into conventional intelligence divisions. Coincidence again, or tidy housekeeping before declassification? No one can say. What matters for our story is what did survive. That single phrase, written almost casually, preserved through clerical inertia. Interference frequency not of Earth. 3 decades later, those words resurfaced online next to the alien voice waveform, as if drawn there by gravity. Maybe someone saw symbolism and built a hoax around it. Maybe it was an unconscious echo, the mind recycling fragments of forgotten public records. Or maybe, and this is what keeps people listening, the original viewer really tapped into a sound that would one day exist in physical form. In intelligence work, documentation isn't just evidence, it's control. Every word archived carries authority long after context evaporates. By surviving it all, Session 77 transformed from failed experiment to mythic seed. Its archival flicker feeds endless reinterpretation because the record itself left space for wonder. The psychic didn't name an alien, only an interference. The analysts didn't declare discovery, only confusion. Between those cautious phrases, belief found a home. When Project 77 voice appeared online, the echo felt immediate. Labels matched, numbers aligned. To curious minds, that couldn't be accident. It was as if the ghost of Stargate had whispered across time. A signal transmitted not through technology, but through expectation. Whether coincidence or foresight, the connection gave the old program new life. Forums lit up with claims that the tape had been predicted in government vaults. Debunkers rushed to trace bit rates, hunting proof of digital generation. Nobody proved anything, but for one brief moment, a forgotten experiment and an unexplained sound merged into a single unanswered question. Can imagination invent reality, or does it sometimes tune into what's coming? What persists isn't evidence, but the tension between skepticism and wonder, the feeling that something almost fits. The archival gap becomes a mirror reflecting whatever each listener wants to hear. Interference, prophecy, or proof that the universe sometimes rhymes before it repeats. That's why the legend of Session 77 endures, why its words still appear in modern analyses of UFO audio. Not because they're verifiable, but because they're nearly so. And that nearly is irresistible. It's the hum under history, the tone, the tape surfaces. In early 1997, somewhere between the dying echoes of dial-up tones and the birth of chat forums, a single file appeared online under an unmarked directory. The file name was simple, project77voice.wave. No description, no metadata. Anyone could download it, though few did. Those who opened it expected static, maybe a prank. What they heard instead was something halfway between melody and machine. The sound lasted just under a minute. A low pulse built into a wavering chant that seemed almost linguistic, repeating syllables that didn't belong to any known phonetic system. The timbre was metallic yet strangely organic, like a human whisper filtered through miles of wire. Within days, the file traveled through early UFO forums where anonymous users debated whether it was proof of extraterrestrial contact or an elaborate hoax. At that time, the internet ran on curiosity more than caution. People copied the audio to floppy disks, traded hashes on IRC channels, and posted spectrogram screenshots showing symmetrical waveforms that looked intentional, as if whatever produced it had structured rhythm. Uploaders claimed it came from a corrupted government data archive. Others insisted it originated from a SETI satellite feed gone rogue. No one agreed. Among those first listeners was a graduate student in acoustic physics named Aaron Jules. He applied rudimentary spectral analysis and reported something odd. The signal's core frequency fluctuated at intervals matching breath patterns of human speech, yet without consonant bursts or recognizable vowels. When he slowed it down by half, faint harmonic overtones emerged, forming patterns that resembled linguistic stress markers. Not random, Jules wrote in a 1997 email later recovered from Usenet archives. Feels organized. Feels spoken. Skeptics pounced, arguing that plenty of analog equipment could create pseudo-voice effects. Early vocoders, malfunctioning tape heads, even shortwave transmissions bleeding from nearby frequencies. Yet each technical explanation solved only part of the puzzle. The recording's dynamic envelope, how the volume rose and fell, mirrored emotional prosody, the subtle rise and dip of human intention. If it was engineered, someone built it with eerie precision. Within weeks, conspiracy forums filled with theories. One faction claimed the name Project 77 Voice, referred to a Pentagon experiment from 1977 suppressed after strange interference at a communications test site. Another said 77 represented coordinates pointing toward a classified lunar region. Threads multiplied, each more elaborate than the last. Moderators deleted many posts after users complained of corrupted downloads or transient audio distortions during playback. Urban legends sprouted overnight. Some claimed the file changed each time it was played. By March 1997, a handful of amateur radio operators had joined the chase. They attempted to trace carrier frequencies that might mirror the waveform. None succeeded, but one operator in Alaska reported hearing a soft choral hum at 4 MHz during auroral interference, almost matching the pattern of the viral clip. Whether coincidence or mass influence, that report ignited wider attention. Around this time, a small online magazine for electronic musicians featured the tape under the headline, "The Internet's First Alien Song." The editors invited readers to remix the sound. Dozens did, stretching and layering it until the original vanished under creative noise. But not everyone treated it as art. Some listeners felt haunted. They described physical reactions, tinnitus, dizziness, a subtle anxiety when the last note faded. It seemed to crawl under the skin more than through the ear. The earliest archived discussion connecting the leak to intelligence agencies appeared that summer. A user going by archive_7 claimed inside knowledge of classified linguistic studies at Fort Meade. They posted fragments of what looked like transcript excerpts referencing non-terrestrial phonemes. No verification ever followed, but one quotation stood out. "We'll hear them before we see them." The phrase matched a comment long buried in declassified Project Stargate material, and that echo spurred journalists to look backward. Throughout late 1997 and 1998, independent investigators attempted to pin down origin data. The compression format pointed to consumer-grade software used on early PCs, likely Windows 95 era. But digital fingerprints suggested multiple encodings, as if the file had been copied several times through different systems before its public appearance. Trace routes led nowhere. Every server that once hosted it vanished or changed ownership within months. The UFO research community split sharply. Debunkers argued that the file was an art school hoax inspired by declassified psychic experiments re-emerging in pop culture. Supporters countered that its psychoacoustic complexity exceeded student capabilities of the time. Analytical comparisons showed resonances organized in numerical ratios approximating 1.618, the golden mean frequent in biological acoustics, a coincidence that believers cited as proof of intelligent origin. When acoustic consultant Ben Hansen later examined the digital copy, he treated it not as mystical evidence but as a forensic challenge. Using techniques similar to those applied in pilot UAP communications, Hansen filtered the waveform for linguistic rhythm and discovered repeating triplet structures repeating precisely every 1.7 seconds. Eerily consistent, yet unlike any known speech timing. Too precise for static, he observed in a lecture years later, but too irregular for a machine tone. Even mainstream media took fleeting interest. A 1998 late-night radio show played the recording and asked listeners to phone in impressions. Hundreds did. Some heard chatter in languages they knew, Arabic, Navajo, Finnish, each swearing it carried fragments of familiarity. Linguists called this auditory pareidolia, the brain's compulsion to impose meaning on noise. Still, that compulsion gave the tape life beyond technical circles. Meanwhile, digital archivists collecting early internet ephemera began noticing pattern overlaps between Project 77 voice and keywords embedded in CIA document dumps newly scanned for public release. One of those documents, dated mid-198s, referenced Session 77, a remote viewing experiment describing an interference frequency not of Earth. Though the file contained no sound, enthusiasts linked numbers and drew a bold conclusion. The psychic in that session had predicted the tape. Once the correlation appeared online, myth fused with data. Blog posts contrasted the tape's pitch variations with a handwritten note from the transcript margin, low, high, low. Side-by-side spectrograms circulated, color gradients matching by chance or fate. Suddenly, the unidentified recording wasn't just another strange audio file, it was prophecy. For those invested in the narrative, the connection felt revelatory. A government psychic heard an alien voice more than a decade before digital technology captured its echo. Critics argued confirmation bias, statistical fluke, pure imagination. Yet even skeptics admitted the temporal symmetry was unsettling. Remote viewers describing sound in 1985, anonymous tape carrying similar cadence 12 years later. Science offered coincidence, story offered destiny. By the end of 1997, that tiny file transformed from fringe oddity to cultural artifact. Universities archived it as example of early online myth formation. Still, each time someone played it aloud, speaker shaking faintly at the final harmonic, they swore it didn't sound quite the same as before. Whether due to compression artifacts or suggestive expectation, the difference kept interest alive. 2 decades later, cleaned versions surfaced again, prompting fresh debates with modern tools. Advanced software revealed what earlier systems couldn't. Faint background hiss consistent with analog tape origin, not purely digital synthesis. That raised a new question. If the sample really came from a physical recording, where was the original reel? No answer ever emerged. Servers closed, contributors vanished into offline lives, and the clip became a ghost in the archives. Its chain of custody broken, its myth intact. Everyone who listens hears something different. Mechanical hum, encrypted message, sung prayer, data glitch, or deliberate construction. But to those who know the deeper history, the coincidence of number 77, the echo of a psychic's words from Fort Meade, the tape still vibrates with unfinished intent. It's not proof of aliens or magic, but a mirror held up to belief itself. A sound that invites you to project meaning into its void. As one archivist wrote years later, it doesn't matter if the voice came from out there or from us. We made it speak the moment we listened. The forensic listeners. When Project 77 voice hit the early research groups, it wasn't the believers who picked it apart first. It was the analysts. Sound engineers, forensic examiners, and self-taught hobbyists who treated every unknown waveform as a puzzle waiting for its solution. They weren't chasing aliens, they were chasing authenticity. One of the first to run the numbers was Ben Hansen, a former FBI-trained audio specialist already known in UFO circles for dissecting pilot-to-tower recordings of unidentified aerial encounters. Hansen approached the file like a crime scene artifact, no mysticism, no bias. He built a timeline comparing volume envelope, frequency drift, and noise patterns across the minute-long sample. Immediately, something stood out: the rhythm. It behaved like language. There were pauses that mimicked breaths, fluctuations suggesting syllables, and melodic rises similar to question inflection in human speech. But the articulation was impossible: no consonant bursts, no mouth-shaped resonance. To isolate origins, Hansen stripped the frequencies layer by layer. Most human voices center around a fundamental between 85 and 255 Hz. The tape's dominant tone oscillated outside that range, hovering near 340 Hz before dipping low at exact 20-second intervals, as if responding to some unrecorded cue. Below that sat a subharmonic pulse he couldn't match to known environmental sources. It wasn't powerline hum, not aircraft radio bleed, not room ventilation noise. When he inverted the waveform, expecting mechanical symmetry, the pattern refused to mirror. It looked shaped. Meanwhile, online engineer collectives recreated the sound using synthesizers available in 1997 to test whether a prankster could have built it. Analog vocoders produced gliding vowels, but lacked the micro-tremor found in the leak. Early digital samplers introduced distortion, but failed to mimic its dynamic envelope. Each test drew the same frustrating conclusion: replication was possible in principle, but improbable without purpose-built tools few hobbyists owned. Skeptics reminded everyone that impossibility wasn't evidence of aliens. Audio anomalies often arise through mundane overlap of technologies, signal interference, cross-modulation, or simple tape degradation. Yet those explanations required coincidence stacked on coincidence. The leak displayed precision too mechanical to be accident and too fluid to be machinery. One data analyst summarized it perfectly: if it's random, it's the most organized randomness I've ever graphed. Hansen turned next to comparative spectral linguistics. With software used in law enforcement for speaker identification, he mapped resonance peaks the way phonetic scientists chart vowels. The diagram hinted at repetition cycles consistent with intentional structure, about 1.6 seconds apart, roughly the cadence of short-spoken phrases. There was even stress hierarchy: louder bursts framed by softer echoes. To human ears it manifested as meaning without meaning, a pattern begging to be translated. Not everyone heard music in chaos. Radio technicians saw familiar ghosts, mixed tones from overlapping channels, maybe triggered when analog transmitters bled into each other. But those artifacts drift randomly in pitch, while this file held steady ratios. One broadcast engineer proposed a different culprit: software voice synthesis. In 1997, that field barely existed, yet primitive neural nets were experimenting with resampling human speech to create textures. If someone combined several fragments of real language, then phase-shifted them beyond recognition, the result might resemble the alien cadence. That theory ignited debate less about aliens than about time, because the 1997 file contained characteristics of generation methods that wouldn't exist widely until the mid-2000s. Either the hoaxer was ahead of their time, or the sample originated elsewhere, possibly from analog tape recorded years earlier. Hansen's amplitude analysis supported the latter. He found microflutter consistent with physical tape transport rather than digital drift. In plain terms, whoever posted the file likely digitized an existing cassette. The question became whose cassette. Forum sleuths cross-referenced noise fingerprints with known environmental spectrums: air conditioning units, lab fluorescence, Navy sonar calibration rooms. One narrowband hiss matched recordings from Fort Meade's internal training auditorium, used in the 198s by Stargate personnel. The similarity was anecdotal but irresistible. People started calling the leak the Meade tape. Linguists volunteered interpretations. Some argued the rhythm resembled proto-language structures from glossolalia, human speech under trance. Others compared it to whale song, pointing out harmonic stacking common in cetacean communication. The wildest proposal linked it to electromagnetic emissions from the planet Jupiter captured by NASA probes. Both exhibited frequency sweeps modulated in repeating three-tone sequences. None of these comparisons proved origin, each only deepened allure. Skeptics answered with psychology. Auditory pareidolia, they said. Just as people see faces in clouds, they hear words in static. Give a listener context, say alien communication, and they'll extract pattern from noise. Experiments confirmed it. When participants heard the sound without description, most labeled it mechanical. When told it might be language, most swore they heard syllables. The mind's need for meaning filled the void. Still, some anomalies resisted dismissal. Fine-grained spectral scans revealed periodic microclicks exactly 18.3 milliseconds apart. In analog gear, such uniformity usually indicates synchronization pulses, devices staying locked to an external clock. Yet this tape predated cheap sync generators. If artificial, whoever made it possessed advanced studio precision. If natural, no known environment produced evenly spaced microclicks at that scale. Around this time, Hansen compared Project 77 voice to the declassified Stargate transcript describing low-high-low tonal sequence. He didn't know about Session 77 when he began. Online researchers pointed it out later. But his graphs lined up, 3 dominant peaks, same frequency ratio. He chuckled in an interview years later, saying, "Coincidence, sure, but an elegant one." Other forensic listeners disagreed. A linguistics professor working with digital archaeologists argued that the sonic intervals followed Fibonacci spacing, each amplitude roughly 1.6 times the previous. "Nature loves that ratio," she said. "Humans replicate it unconsciously." Maybe the psychic in 1985 described what subconscious mathematics already dictates. The so-called match between transcript and tape might simply expose our innate aesthetic bias for balance. While arguments raged in chat threads and conference panels, a quiet minority kept probing acoustic minutiae. They noticed the noise floor, background hiss, shifted slightly every time the file was downloaded from different sources. That suggested multiple original transfers rather than a single compressed copy. Beneath that hiss, they detected shadow frequencies rising when the main tone dipped, forming mirror images in reverse phase. To believers, it resembled call and response, dialogue encoded within resonance. Hansen remained cautious but fascinated. He wrote in a field memo, "Signal exhibits modulation implying intentionality, though source undetermined. Recommend comparison to pilot-to-controller UAP audio for structural similarity." When he did, the resemblances surprised him. The 2024 Air Force leak showing a pilot's breathless reaction to an unidentified object carried similar modulation spikes and background noise, minor in amplitude yet rhythmically equivalent. It didn't mean aliens spoke through both. It meant human stress and electronics can coincidentally sculpt the same strange architecture of sound. This realization reframed the mystery. Maybe the 1997 recording wasn't a message from elsewhere, but an echo of us. Technology and expectation intertwining to form an artificial language of belief. Yet the residue of mystery refused to fade. Even after countless spectral dissections, no absolute mundane source fit perfectly. Each explanation left one thread loose, an asymmetry that kept ears tuned for something beyond the rational. That tension fueled a new research niche, forensic semiotics, the study of meaning in unexplained signals. Scholars treated Project 77 voice as cultural text rather than cosmic transmission. They mapped its influence on everything from internet folklore to sound art. A noise once dismissed as prank evolved into case study of how humans transform anomalies into stories. And yet, whenever the file resurfaces, analysts still reopen notebooks, running updated algorithms just in case the data hides new layers. They call themselves listeners, half scientist, half believer. They know probabilities, they know hoaxes, but they still listen. Because buried inside that minute of impossible tone lies the hint of structure that refuses to die, a pattern that sounds almost aware. In the end, forensic listening did what science always does. Stripped mystery to its measurable bones, only to reveal a deeper one underneath. The voice may be human machinery or filtered art, but its persistence, its capacity to imitate intent, keeps curiosity alive. The experts proved nothing conclusive, yet they captured something else entirely. A portrait of attention itself, humanity leaning forward toward the static, daring it to speak back. The overlap no one expected. For 20 years the Project 77 voice recording existed as curiosity, a digital ghost passed among collectors and dismissed by scientists. Then one researcher compared its audio fingerprint to a forgotten page from the Stargate archives, and everything folded in on itself. The two sources, separated by a decade and born in different eras of technology, shared what shouldn't have been shareable, structure. It began at a small university lab when linguistics graduate Maya Kellen tried converting the waveform into phonetic notation just to test software precision. She aligned energy peaks onto a frequency ladder and labeled each with arbitrary syllables. Halfway through, her algorithm flagged repeating trios, low, high, low. She thought it was a bug until she read a declassified transcript someone had attached as background reference. In its margin, a psychic from session 77 had written the same sequence: low, high, low, record if perceived. Coincidence, perhaps. But Kellen layered both on a timeline and ran a statistical correlation. The overlay produced a near-perfect alignment of 0.96. In acoustic analysis, an absurdly high match between two unrelated datasets. She stared at the output as if it had spoken back. The Stargate transcript was dated 1985. The audio entered cyberspace in 1997. One psychic note now seemed to predict future sound. News of her finding leapt through online forums faster than the original leak ever had. Phrases like temporal resonance and acoustic precognition flooded discussions. Most scientists brushed it off, confirmation bias multiplied by internet echo chambers, but others quietly downloaded her dataset. Even skeptics admitted the patterning was odd. Linguistic rhythms normally fall within certain prosodic arcs: stress, pause, emphasis. The tape followed those arcs precisely, yet produced syllables no linguistic model could classify. Psychologists offered one explanation: expectation loops. Humans, they said, crave symmetry. When two patterns share loose similarity, the brain locks them together, gluing coincidence into certainty. But pattern recognition is also how science finds truth. The same instinct that led astronomers to spot repeating pulses and call them quasars. Where, then, does recognition end and revelation start? Kellen invited Ben Hansen to test her correlation. He approached with characteristic skepticism, importing both spectrograms into his forensic suite. On separate monitors, one graph pulsed red from 1985's described frequencies, the other blue from the 1997 recording. When he overlaid them, a third color appeared, not full purple but streaks of interference like dialogue wavelengths crossing. They share energy at key harmonics, he muttered. Not identical but conversational. He meant acoustically overlapping yet out of phase, as if answer met echo. To quantify that language like tempo, Hansen examined timing between peaks. The gaps averaged roughly 170 milliseconds, the cadence of human short phrases. That same timing appeared in the psychic's note of cycling modulation. Could coincidence repeat itself this precisely? Statistically, yes. Emotionally, no. Viewers online called it evidence that human consciousness and future technology might connect through some unknown informational field. Scholars called it fantasy fueled by numerology, but neither side could make the graphs unmatch. The deeper analysis produced stranger consequences. When researchers mapped the pitch contour onto musical notation, they discovered intervals corresponding to minor key triads common in melancholic composition. The psychic who coined tone through the dark might literally have been describing chords. Some guessed the mind converts visual impressions into sound analogs, explaining overlap. Others insisted the psychic didn't translate, he transmitted. Debate fractured along philosophical lines. One camp called patterns artifacts of measurement. Every dataset hides repetition if you sample long enough. Another claimed unconscious foresight, that minds sometimes intuit shapes of things not yet built. Jung called it synchronicity. Statisticians call it probability clusters. At the intersection of both definitions stands this anomaly, a voice that seems to arrive before its origin. To move beyond symbolism, Kellen's team fed both datasets into machine learning software designed for comparative linguistics. The model's verdict shocked even cynics. 78% structural similarity between the psychic's transcribed syllable sequence and the 1997 waveform's amplitude structure. For context, unrelated human languages like English and Mandarin score around 40. Whatever produced that tape, Kellen said, followed rules, our rules just bent. Media seized on her quote. CIA psychic predicted alien's voice. One headline blared, echoing the documentary's future title. Talk shows invited her to explain temporal coincidences. She tried to clarify that statistics aren't destiny, only patterns seen through curiosity's lens. But nuance died under applause. Every interview reinforced the myth. The remote viewer heard the recording before microphones existed. Inside academic circles, the controversy sparked secondary studies on anomalous convergence. Cognitive scientists replayed the 1997 file to volunteers while flashing random numbers. Some participants began drawing wave-like shapes similar to spectra without realizing. The phenomenon, automatic mimicry induced by rhythmic sound, hinted at neural entrainment, the brain syncing to external cycles. Perhaps the psychic in 1985 experienced a comparable neurological resonance, mistaking internal rhythm for external message. It's elegant, tidy, rational, and unsatisfying, because rationality can't erase that uncanny 0.96 correlation score. It can only reframe it as frontier data waiting for context. Skeptics reduce it to coincidence, believers call it confirmation. Both fuel the same obsession, understanding how pattern persistence defies probability's cold authority. Meanwhile, cross-disciplinary teams compared the 1997 tape, not just with Stargate notes, but with natural phenomena: whale communication, magnetospheric whistlers, cosmic radio bursts. Nothing matched perfectly, yet each shared motif appeared near the golden ratio pacing embedded in speech feel, the human tendency toward rhythmic beauty. Could that be the bridge, the universal constant connecting psychic impression and physical manifestation? Government agencies stayed silent. The CIA reaffirmed there had been no alien language research, only linguistic training for human agents. NASA specialists who reviewed the file said any resemblance between audio and transcripts was coincidental patterning produced by narrowband modulation. But silence from officialdom only deepened intrigue. When institutions refuse comment, absence sounds like echo. As discourse expanded, so did artistry. Musicians sampled both files, overlaying psychic phrases whispered by actors atop the metallic hum. The result was haunting, music that seemed to breathe. Audiences unaware of the backstory described feeling, watched while listening. Even skeptics admitted its psychological impact, evidence that belief transforms noise into narrative. Maya Kellen eventually withdrew from the spotlight, leaving one line in a paper footnote. Statistical correlation does not imply temporal causation, yet uncertainty remains the amplifier of wonder. That sentence encapsulated the entire saga. Whether cause preceded effect or imagination stitched fragments together afterward, no one could disprove the correspondence. Years later, when AI researchers revisited her data with improved tools, they confirmed the numerical match still held, noise and all. Probability tables said 1 in tens of millions. Not impossible, but heavy with coincidence. Perhaps random oscillations converge by chance across memory and time. Perhaps minds fill gaps better than algorithms. Either way, the overlap endures because it tickles the same reflex that made intelligence agencies study psychic spies in the first place: the suspicion that perception leaks. So, was the 1997 voice born from human technology, echoing a forgotten experiment? Or did a psychic once tune into a future frequency already waiting to be heard? Science can't answer, stories refuse to quiet. Between data and dream lies that shared low-high-low refrain, looping across years, reminding anyone who listens that sometimes patterns demand belief before proof. And while academia debates significance, the sound keeps traveling, played, re-encoded, compressed again, each copy slightly altered yet rhythmically faithful. Like two signals chasing one another through decades, neither quite catching up, both whispering the same impossible melody across time's static. The myth of CIA alien linguistics. For decades, rumors claimed the CIA possessed experts devoted to breaking extraterrestrial languages, a hidden unit of cryptographers deciphering alien syntax behind locked doors. It sounded plausible. After all, this was the same agency that ran psychic experiments and monitored UFO reports. But reality, as so often happens, was both less dramatic and more revealing about how myths form. Inside the intelligence community, yes, there was language training. The CIA's Intelligence Language Institute, founded in the early 1995s, remains a rigorous school where officers master human tongues for espionage and diplomacy. Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Farsi, the repertoire spans continents, but every word taught belongs to Earth. Graduates learn to blend into cities, not decode cosmic chatter. Nothing in the curriculum ever hinted at extraterrestrial linguistics. Yet that mundane truth didn't still public imagination once Project Stargate leaked into daylight. After remote viewing transcripts mentioning non-human intelligences became public, conspiracy circles fused fragments of different facts. Psychic spies at Fort Meade, UFO investigations in the 195s, cryptologic papers from the NSA. Stitched together, they created the perfect legend, a government quietly translating messages from elsewhere. In online threads, that theory hardened into certainty. The CIA's alien language division, users insisted, was buried with Stargate. Reality told another story. During the early Cold War, the CIA's documented UFO work focused on national security, not communication. Analysts worried that mysterious lights in the sky might mask Soviet aircraft or psychological operations. Declassified memos show meetings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base where intelligence officers reviewed sightings, classifying 90% as conventional phenomena: balloons, aircraft, weather events. Their goal was threat assessment, not conversation. Meanwhile, in another corner of government, cryptologists at the NSA engaged in purely theoretical puzzles. If a message from another civilization ever arrived, how might we recognize it? Those discussions birthed academic papers on universal communication, mathematics as a shared language. They imagined pulses of prime numbers or repeating geometric ratios, not syllables or voices. The motivation was curiosity, not secret contact. But because the NSA kept those studies classified for years, outsiders later connected imaginary dots. CIA plus UFOs plus cryptology equaled alien linguistics. An elegant equation, just wrong. Still, myths often reveal deeper truths about public psychology. The United States had experimented with psychic espionage through Project Stargate. That fact proved governments would chase even extraordinary possibilities. So when enthusiasts heard of linguistic research elsewhere, they merged it into one grand narrative. Documents use overlapping jargon, signals, decoding, non-terrestrial hypotheses, language flexible enough to blur lines. To a reader searching for evidence of interplanetary dialogue, the overlap looked deliberate. By the mid-199s, after Stargate's closure, curiosity outpaced facts. Declassified files flooded archives without context. Researchers scrolling through thousands of scanned pages stumbled on phrases like communication study or signal interference and assumed hidden continuity. In truth, those sections discussed standard intelligence linguistics, methods for intercepting foreign radio or analyzing enemy propaganda. But when disconnected from purpose, the words sounded cosmic. Pop culture amplified misunderstanding. Television specials cited recently released CIA language research, leaving out that it concerned French idioms. Fictional adaptations blurred further, portraying psychic translators deciphering alien transmissions. Inevitably, audiences folded fiction into fact. Every real acronym became suspect. ILI sounded like Interplanetary Linguistic Initiative. Internet copywriters turned footnotes into evidence, and evidence into legend. Adding to confusion, intelligence agencies rarely comment on misconceptions. Silence is their instinct, and silence feeds speculation. When questioned about linguistic analysis of extraterrestrial communication, a CIA spokesperson simply reiterated that no such program existed. To conspiracy enthusiasts, that sounded like confirmation by omission. In secrecy studies, scholars call this the vacuum effect. Absence of data behaves like presence of mystery. Analytically, there's irony here. The only American institution ever to seriously map hypothetical alien languages wasn't the CIA at all but the NSA, through academic think pieces examining mathematical universality. One paper suggested any advanced civilization would rely on prime sequences as the foundation of syntax. Another discussed using binary amplitude modulation as linguistic atoms. These weren't hidden experiments, but intellectual exercises, no contact, only conjecture. Yet because they carried classified labels, their eventual release decades later seemed explosive. Few readers noticed publication dates older than most UFO databases. Journalists seeking sensational copy tied those dry studies to supposed leaked tapes. Were the same analysts decoding the alien voice, they asked. That question alone cemented association. To truth seekers primed by years of half-revealed psychic history, denial felt inadequate. Someone had to be studying the tape, right? Surely agencies that once spent millions on remote viewing wouldn't ignore a sound claiming to contain non-human speech. The logic was circular but emotionally airtight. Belief demanded bureaucracy. In that sense, the myth fulfilled a human need more than a factual gap. Every civilization wants translators between the known and unknown. Priests once filled that role, then scientists, now intelligence agencies. Imagining the CIA as universal linguist makes mystery administrable, a secret we can picture instead of void we must face. The narrative comforts as much as it unsettles. It reassures us someone, somewhere, is listening professionally. Behind the scenes, actual government linguists did occasionally examine strange audio, but not for extraterrestrial meaning. Forensic specialists study unidentified communications, pirate broadcasts, encrypted chatter, even wildlife recordings mistaken for signals. Their job is pattern recognition, not cosmic conversation. When unusual frequency clusters appear, analysts test mechanical explanations long before entertaining life forms. The leap from unknown to alien skips every intermediate possibility humanity usually inhabits. Nonetheless, the misperception lingers because it harmonizes perfectly with history's tone. The CIA once explored mind reading, so why not voice reading? Cold War paranoia combined with declassification ambiguity turned bureaucratic acronyms into mystical symbols. A memo about language normalization algorithms referenced machine translation training. Google Translate's ancestor, but rumor recast it as alien decryption software. Every retelling adds layers like echo through data. Videos on fringe networks cite CIA docs proving alien linguistics, often displaying genuine documents on screen. Viewers freeze frames, circle words such as signal, message, frequency, ignoring mundane context that follows. Training objectives, listening post-transcripts, terrestrial interceptions. It's cherry-picking as storytelling craft. Build enigma by omission until blanks form silhouette of belief. Even inside academic study of folklore, Project 77 voice now represents textbook myth formation. It fuses credible fragments, psychic experiments, audio anomalies, declassified jargon, into a single cohesive illusion. What makes it potent is plausibility. Each piece true individually, false only in combination. And because agencies resist narrative correction, myth becomes self-sustaining. Yet dismissing it entirely misses the psychological elegance. Belief in a CIA alien language department reflects faith in our own potential to understand the incomprehensible. It imagines bureaucracy as bridge to the cosmos, paperwork as priesthood. The same impulse that drove Stargate psychics to hear tones through the dark now drives online archaeologists parsing static for semantics. In both cases, humanity bends silence into message. When skeptics expose the real picture, that the CIA trains for human dialects, not alien tongues, the myth doesn't die. It adapts. Followers claim cover story, saying the Institute's global spread of teachers conveniently hides cosmic expertise. Evidence absent becomes proof hidden deeper. That circularity ensures endurance. Myth thrives on the impossibility of closure. By tracing this misunderstanding, we see how Project Stargate's spectral legacy infected unrelated programs, dragging mundane linguistics into extraterrestrial lore. The phrase decoding alien speech sells, while improving translation proficiency does not. Over time, repetition turned curiosity to conviction. And so the imagined department persists in documentaries, novels, and algorithms searching spectral data for syntax humans haven't invented yet. Still, embedded in exaggeration lies one valuable reminder: communication, wherever it arises, demands interpretation. Whether translating Russian intercepts or analyzing a mysterious recording labeled Project 77 voice, the act remains the same, turning noise into meaning. The CIA never employed star-tongue translators, but humanity collectively does each time we listen for pattern in the dark. And that brings us back to our investigation. Because now that the bureaucratic myths are cleared away, the question can focus where substance truly resides, not in secret linguists, but in sound itself. What does science actually reveal when confronting an audio enigma? To find out, we shift from legend to laboratory, from speculation to measurement, toward the scientific scrutiny of anomalous recordings and the fragile boundary between interference and intention. Scientific reality check. For years, curiosity eclipsed caution. People obsessed over Project 77 voice, comparing spectrograms to psychic transcripts, chasing mystery across decades. But eventually the speculation had to meet measurement. When the excitement cooled, scientists, real acousticians, physicists, and aerospace analysts took a closer listen. What they found didn't erase the wonder, it rearranged it. First came the simple question that every investigator asks. If something extraordinary has happened, where's the corroboration? Real unidentified aerial phenomenon investigations hinge on sensor convergence, radar returns, optical confirmation, multiple witnesses. A sound without context, no coordinates, no device log. By investigative standards, it's weightless data. Still, history shows that even the most disciplined pilots have reported noises accompanying visual anomalies. Those reports proved useful not because they solved the puzzle, but because they revealed how humans react when the unexplained intrudes on routine. Take the September 2024 Air Force encounter. A pilot flying a Beechcraft 350C suddenly radioed that a dark, cylindrical object had just passed beneath his wing at 20,000 feet. The air traffic recording captured disbelief and procedure colliding in real time. Analysts like Ben Hansen turned that audio into measurement, calculating speed, direction, even thermal plausibility. The object's inferred velocity reached Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. Hard data born from emotion on tape. But even that compelling case remained inconclusive until radar and flight telemetry verified the anomaly's trace. That's the difference between evidence and atmosphere. When specialists applied that same discipline to the 1997 recording, the verdict was sobering. Without parallel instrumentation, no radar, infrared, or positional data, the sound couldn't stand alone. More importantly, its very structure betrayed human origin. The waveform carried compression artifacts typical of 199's consumer audio capture. Peaks sat neatly within the limited dynamic range of cassette microphones. Harmonics rolled off exactly where analog decks of the era cut frequencies. Statistical randomness masquerading as exotic rhythm often reproduces those shapes. Yet the signals organization still perplexed labs. Teams at 2 universities compared it against hundreds of known interference profiles. Power lines at 50 and 60 Hz, shortwave cross-modulation, aviation radios, even ground-penetrating radar spillover. None aligned perfectly. Some features, like repeating triplet cadences, were rare. Others, microclick spacing, fit patterns found when tape heads skip across partially erased layers. In other words, the voice could be an accidental palimpsest, old content ghosting beneath new recording. That possibility re-anchored the conversation in physics. Imagine a reused cassette, already carrying faint audio, speech, music, perhaps static, then recorded over with ambient noise. Imperfect erasure leaves residual magnetization. When digitized, those remnants phase shift, producing harmonic sweeps identical to formant patterns. To an untrained listener, that sounds eerily linguistic. The so-called alien modulations might just be yesterday's conversation bleeding through. Skeptics cite another technological culprit, radio frequency interference from nearby electronics. In the 199s, cordless phones and early Wi-Fi prototypes emitted gigahertz signals that audio amplifiers sometimes converted into audible buzz. If multiple transmitters pulsed irregularly, they produced fluctuating tones that seemed to speak. Engineers demonstrated this by recording near decommissioned satellite dishes. The playback sounded uncannily like rhythmic chanting. Mystery manufactured by modulation. But some anomalies defied even that pragmatic comfort. When the 1997 sample was re-examined using modern AI analysis, models trained to differentiate human and mechanical sound labeled segments as indeterminate. Machine learning exposed subtle amplitude variations corresponding to the golden ratio timing seen in biological speech. The algorithm didn't call it alien, just patterned beyond noise. To scientists, that phrasing means incomplete understanding, not cosmic signature. Still, to believers, the distinction hardly mattered. NASA physicist Joshua Semeter, part of a later UAP study panel, summarized the discipline's frustration. Audio alone never suffices. Reliable investigation demands simultaneous sensors, optical, radar, infrared, offering triangulated data. Otherwise, analysts risk chasing artifacts of perspective. A microphone, like a human eye, lies easily. Infrared cameras misinterpret heat gradients as movement. Parallax can make stationary lights seem to accelerate. Likewise, moving recorders can transform simple interference into dynamic melody. Without context, the tape's voice may just be the acoustic equivalent of a mirage. Even so, the scientific method doesn't dismiss anomalies entirely. It reframes them. Researchers asked what behavioral truths such sounds reveal. Psychologists found that people exposed to ambiguous tones consistently report meaningful perception, language, emotion, intention within seconds. The brain's predictive machinery shapes chaos into communication. From an evolutionary perspective, that reflex kept ancestors alive. Hearing structure and noise meant detecting danger faster. In the digital age, it builds viral mythology. Therefore, the real variable isn't signal integrity, but listener expectation. Those who play Project 77 voice, knowing its rumored origin, almost always rate it intelligent. Play it anonymously, stripped of story, and they call it defective audio. Mystery isn't in the waveform, it's in framing. Still, that framing fuels continuing study because curiosity itself becomes measurable. Tracking heart rate and brain activity, cognitive scientists observed spikes resembling mild fight or flight when participants expected the recording to be alien, despite identical sound input. Belief alters physiology. In applied research, such findings help pilots and operators differentiate sensory data from stress hallucination. In UFO casework, understanding perception bias turns frightening encounters into teachable data points. The so-called alien voice serves as training model, an auditory Rorschach exposing how humans translate uncertainty into narrative. That's where modern technology circles back to ancient impulse. Artificial intelligence speech synthesis now generates voices indistinguishable from human tone. Some creators intentionally design non-human timbres using detuned harmonic clusters, essentially replicating the same patterns once thought impossible in 1997. Ironically, innovation fulfilled the myth. Machines learned to sound alien. What was eerie speculation became commodity art. So could the tape be nothing more than early experimentation, decades ahead of its time? Possibly. Voice synthesis research existed quietly inside laboratories developing text-to-speech systems for accessibility. Early prototypes produced phonetic noise, startlingly like the later leak. Few left the lab, but leaks happen. If one of those prototypes escaped onto primitive web servers, it would resemble exactly what the world mistook for cosmic communication. Yet even the most rigorous explanation leaves residue, a whisper of uncertainty between probability and proof. Scientists acknowledge it. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, cautioned one acoustician, borrowing the old phrase reluctantly. Every dataset retains noise that resists categorization. Whether that remainder hides information or simply random distribution, human imagination rushes to fill the gap. That gap ultimately explains persistence. The voice endures not because it proves external intelligence, but because it demonstrates internal pattern hunger. As long as perception seeks symmetry, as long as coincidence tingles like connection, recordings like Project 77 voice will outlive debunkings. They remind researchers why transparency matters, publishing data, cross-checking censors, archiving context. Without those steps, even trivial interference can morph into legend. And legend, once born, self-perpetuates. Each retelling amplifies harmonics absent in the source, transforming science into folklore. Ironically, the scientific review doesn't silence believers. It legitimizes curiosity by acknowledging mystery's emotional gravity. The discipline insists on evidence, yet concedes wonder's endurance. In official panels today, when analysts replay anomalous cockpit audio, they do so not to chase extraterrestrial whispers, but to study communication under uncertainty. They ask, how do humans respond to the inexplicable? Project 77 voice fits perfectly as case study, a feedback loop between expectation and acoustics. Whether it began as interference, hoax, or prototype, its power lies in what it teaches about us. Under laboratory light, the cosmic narrative collapses into human fingerprints, magnetic residue, aliasing, compression. Still, listen closely at the fade-out. There's cadence masked inside distortion, rhythm within randomness. That's the paradox the scientists can't extinguish. Each analysis closes one question and opens another. Maybe that's why, after charts and models, they still hit play again, headphones poised, hoping to catch something just out of range. The human need to hear the unknown. What drives a person to press play on a sound everyone else calls meaningless? Maybe it's the same impulse that once drove soldiers in dark rooms to stare at blank walls, hoping to glimpse something beyond. Curiosity never sleeps, it only changes medium. For centuries, people have leaned toward the unknown, not away from it. The Project 77 voice recording became more than noise because it offered exactly what every mystery promises: participation. You weren't just hearing a tape, you were joining a search. Psychologists call it apophenia, the perception of patterns where none exist. But that label only half explains what happens inside our heads. Pattern seeking is instinct, the mind's radar sweeping chaos for signal. We evolved listening for predators in rustling grass, reading emotion in tone before words had grammar. That same reflex still fires when we confront something baffling. It whispers, interpret, connect, survive. In that sense, hearing meaning in static isn't delusion, it's history echoing through biology. Every listener who obsessed over the 1997 tape reenacted a primordial drama. The ear caught vibration, the brain supplied narrative. Some imagined alien broadcasters testing channels, others pictured classified satellites bleeding secret data. Even skeptics felt the tug of what if. The voice became a mirror for expectation. It didn't matter that science found cassette artifacts or compression residue. Belief filled those technical gaps with storylines wide enough for the cosmos. Inside Project Stargate, the same mechanism had once transformed faint mental impressions into reports of otherworldly towers and singing tones. The remote viewers weren't frauds, they were humans under institutional pressure to find sense in ambiguity. When you're told the mind can locate threats oceans away, imagination becomes duty. Their tones through the dark reveal how easily meaning blooms in uncertainty when authority nurtures it. That's why, decades later, the public reacted almost identically. Replace remote viewing chambers with computer screens, psychic coordinates with file hashes, and the ritual is the same. Interpret the unexplainable together. Online forums became seance tables, participants feeding off each other's wonder. They replayed the clip at different speeds, concatenated fragments backward, hunted hidden structure, modern divination via waveform. What they wanted wasn't proof but communion. Sociologists note that collective mystery tightens bonds. Shared ambiguity creates tribe. In the late 199s, Project 77 voice forged one of the first digital belief communities. Threads filled with volunteers decoding imaginary phonemes became proto-social networks bound by rather than ideology. Some built faith around contact, others framed it as art, all participated in an emergent folklore written in binary. The sound became less about extraterrestrials than about us discovering each other across early internet wilderness. Curiosity isn't passive, it's hunger with rhythm. The same drive that funded psychic espionage also fuels citizen science, SETI scanners, conspiracy podcasts, and late-night listeners chasing whispers beyond static. It's the North Star of the species. Every unanswered question hums like promise. Even skeptics depend on that charge. Without believers, there's nothing to debunk, no dialogue between rational and fantastical. The friction sustains progress. Neuroscience adds another dimension. Studies show that uncertainty activates reward circuits similar to anticipation of pleasure. The brain releases dopamine when expectation teeters. So when a listener strains to extract syllables from the alien tape, they're literally experiencing mini surges of excitement. Curiosity becomes biochemical addiction. That's why people return to the recording even after rational explanations. Comprehension ends the rush, ambiguity keeps it alive. For remote viewers decades earlier, that chemical lure might have been stronger. Locked in sensory deprivation, every mental flicker felt significant. Over time, their brains rewarded imaginative leaps as success. The program inadvertently trained pattern intoxication. The same reinforcement cycle now plays out on forums and podcasts, just without sealed rooms or CIA funding. When mystery drops into a communal feed, dopamine becomes viral. Still, there's something noble in that persistence. Humanity keeps listening because silence feels unbearable. The vastness of the universe suggests company. The absence of evidence feels like exclusion. A mysterious sound, no matter how terrestrial, temporarily fills that void. It says connection might exist. Whether broadcast by stars or circuitry, it reassures us that communication is possible. Anthropologists trace similar rituals across cultures. Oracles reading wind noise, shamans interpreting whistles in caves, priests decoding hums from sacred wells. Each practice turns randomness into relationship. Project 77 voice is simply the digital descendant of that lineage, a techno-shamanic relic where the modem replaces the drum. The myth's endurance shows how modern skepticism never fully extinguished ancient wonder. It just migrated into bandwidth. Listen closely to how fans describe the recording even now. They rarely talk about fear. They talk about familiarity, something in the tone that feels human, yet evolved, as if empathy disguised as alien. That paradox comforts them. It implies we could recognize other intelligence because it would resonate emotionally first, semantically later. The dream isn't invasion or revelation, it's companionship through sound. AI developers creating artificial voices unknowingly tap the same yearning. When engineers tweak synthetic harmonics to sound non-human but kind, they chase an aesthetic born from Project 77 voice, the thrill of almost understanding. Modern AI can simulate alien articulation flawlessly, but none of those files stir audiences like that grainy minute from 1997. Authentic anomalies carry imperfection, tiny inconsistencies that invite projection. Machines now imitate that imperfection on purpose. The circle closes, technology copying mystery to make listeners feel alive. Community reactions prove the phenomenon's permanence. Whenever researchers release clean versions, listeners swear the emotion changes. More sorrowful here, more hopeful there. Scientifically, differences stem from equalization filters, but perception insists otherwise. We keep hearing what mirrors our mood. In a way, the voice adapts to its audience like a psychological instrument. Each playback writes a new myth calibrated to whoever dares to listen. This flexibility is why skepticism never kills such legends. Debunking may satisfy intellect, but emotion craves ambiguity's heartbeat. Knowing the sound likely came from recycled tape doesn't erase the weight people felt while hearing it. Emotion logs the experience as truth of another sort, a reminder that belief isn't about facts but participation in possibility. When governments chase anomalies through classified programs, or when citizens dissect grainy files, they enact the same faith in discovery. That meaning hides waiting for recognition. Sometimes it yields satellites and scientific revolutions. Other times it births conspiracies and art. Either outcome expands awareness. Curiosity, disciplined or wild, keeps the species listening. That's the hidden symmetry between Project Stargate's psychics and the internet's forensic amateurs. Both turned attention into antennae, both blurred line between detection and imagination, and both revealed that the deeper signal might not travel through electromagnetic fields at all, but through desire itself. The universe didn't send a voice, we invoked one by wanting it. So perhaps the alien language was never alien. Perhaps it was the sound of our own longing modulated through generations of equipment and expectation. A cosmic mirror humming back our question. Is anyone there? When you press play, that's what you're really asking. And when the recording answers with incomprehensible rhythm, it gives permission to keep asking. Because the need to hear the unknown isn't madness or superstition. It's the root of every exploration, from cave echoes to deep space antennas. Each hum, each flicker of pattern, keeps proof unnecessary but hope alive. The voice, whatever its origin, reminds us that curiosity itself speaks, timeless and fluent, in every language we haven't yet translated. Echoes of curiosity. In the end, what began as a stray hiss of data became a mirror for every story humanity ever told about itself. The so-called alien voice was never just a sound. It was a question wrapped in vibration, proof not of contact but of craving. Across decades of analysis and speculation, engineers, psychics, and dreamers all leaned toward the same invisible horizon, listening for confirmation that awareness isn't confined to a single planet or species. Strip away the conspiracies, and what remains is emotion. A soldier in a windowless room describing tones through the dark. A forum user holding a floppy disk to the light, wondering if they've intercepted a message meant for someone else. A scientist graphing harmonics that refuse to sit still. Each of them participates in the same ritual, transforming uncertainty into connection. The data becomes secondary. The act of listening itself is the point. Every replay of Project 77 voice, on cassette decks, in algorithmic renderings, through headphones, extends that ritual. The recording changes slightly with every conversion, picking up new compression scars, new frequencies born of human interference. Those artifacts are our fingerprints, proof that we're still trying to join the conversation. Sometimes the interference is literal static, sometimes it's disbelief. Yet each distortion adds harmony to the larger composition of curiosity. Perhaps that's why the legend won't fade. Facts settle, but wonder reverberates. We keep returning to these mysteries because they frame our loneliness as potential rather than emptiness. The psychic's phrase, "we'll hear them before we see them," survives because it captures that hope. Hearing precedes sight in every sense. It's the first sense we develop, the first. We used to find one another in the dark. So whether the voice was magnetic residue or the whisper of something beyond measurement, its significance stays human. It demonstrates that imagination can function like an antenna, pulling faint patterns from reality and amplifying them into meaning. The noise floor becomes narrative, the random becomes rhythmic. In that alchemy lies the real message. That consciousness, ever curious, keeps inventing reasons to listen. Maybe that's the essence of exploration. Long before rockets pierced the sky, minds reached outward with questions. Every detector we build, every experiment we launch, every myth we nurture begins as a single act of attention. The universe answers not with clarity, but with echo, tiny reflections bouncing back to remind us we're part of the same resonance we seek. And sometimes that echo hums in the strangest places. A declassified folder, a forgotten tape, a file attached to a dying message board. We mistake coincidence for correspondence, but maybe that's enough. Maybe meaning doesn't require origin, only recognition. The alien voice endures because its ambiguity gives shape to our collective imagination, turning silence into possibility. So when the final harmonic fades and the noise dissolves into quiet, listen again, not for proof, but for presence. In that fading signal, you can almost hear the untranslatable language of curiosity itself, repeating the oldest message we know. Are we alone? The answer, hidden in our heartbeat and electricity, remains the same. Not while we're still listening. If you want to follow the next thread into newly uncovered archives, unexplained transmissions, and forgotten government projects, subscribe and keep chasing these echoes with us. There's always another frequency waiting, another story vibrating just beyond hearing. And maybe, somewhere in that static, something is listening back.